Hey there guys, today we're taking a look at Forza Horizon 5 running on the AMD Ryzen 5 5500U and the 5560U. We're doing a comparison between the two of them. Now we're going to be using the built-in benchmark, and both of these are running on the exact same graphics drivers, which is the 22.11.2 drivers. Now what you're seeing on the screen right now is the game running with the built-in benchmark at the lowest in-game graphics settings, which is the very low preset, but at the full 1080p resolution with absolutely no upscaler whatsoever. Now, after running the built-in benchmark on both of them 3 times to get a rough average out of them, we ended up with the 5560U getting a FPS average of 39 with 1% lows of 30, while the 5500U got an average of 45 but 1% lows of 26. So there is a distinct difference for sure between the two GPUs that we have on these systems. And in general, the 5500U with its one extra GPU core and 200 megahertz higher clock speed is just giving us an overall higher average, though the 1% lows suffer a little bit here. Now switching over to using FSR at the quality setting between the two systems, the gap still continues to be very obvious, with the 5560U getting an FPS average of 32 and 1% lows of 25, while the 5500U gets an average of 37 and 1% lows of 26. So it seems that FSR 2.2's overhead really did a number on the 5560U, and it ended up dropping the 1% lows to actually lower than they were just running at the full native 1080p resolution. Neither really scored particularly well in this, just because of the fact that we are still in the 30s range, with 1% lows dropping into the mid 20s, so neither one is exactly a great experience like this, but the 5500U is showing to be a more capable chip here. Now going with FSR at the balance preset pretty much ends up netting us a small improvement over where we were at before. This time around, the 5560U ends up getting an FPS average of 34 with 1% lows of 28, while the 5500U ends up with an average of 40 and 1% lows of 30. So overall, the 5500U is just winning in this one still. And it really seems like the upgraded GPU on this is just overall making up for the IPC gain that came from Zen 3 being used on the 5560U. Now going with the performance preset for FSR still at the lowest in-game graphics settings, the gap between the two just still becomes very apparent, with the 5560U getting an average of 37 and 1% lows of 29, while the 5500U ends up getting an average of 43 with 1% lows of 32. So the 5500U still seems to have a noticeable lead here and is overall going to get you the better gaming experience. And the lead for the 5500U pretty much carries over to the ultra performance preset for FSR. The 5560U ends up giving us an average of 42 with 1% lows of 32, while the 5500U gets us an average of 48 and 1% lows of 35. This is a pretty notable gap here, just in the sense that the 5500U is getting very close to an almost 60 FPS average, while the 5560U is pretty much still in the low 40s. At this point, neither one is really going to give you a bad experience while playing the game, but there is a noticeable difference between the 5500U and the 5560U, and the improvements that come from the faster CPU in the 5560U are just not translating to a game that is this GPU heavy. Now the game also supports FidelityFX CAS upscaling, which is a very early version of what FSR eventually ended up becoming. Now this is mostly just a sharpening filter that just renders the game at a lower resolution and just uses sharpening to make it look a little bit better. Very basic and rudimentary, but I'm glad that they left it present in this game even after adding FSR, because this works better on much lower end hardware since it has very low overhead. So what you can actually do is lower the in-game render resolution and just get a little bit of sharpening to boost things up, and this is running with the ultra quality preset for it, and the level of performance that we're getting out of this is really nice on both systems, but you can very much tell the difference between the 5560U and the 5500U, with the 5560U giving us an average of 43 and 1% lows of 34, while the 5500U gave us an average of 51 and 38 for 1% lows. This is a pretty noticeable gap between the two, and it makes the 5500U a much more noticeably playable experience, especially with the uplift in those 1% lows. And if we go with the performance preset for the FidelityFX CAS upscaling, we end up with a FPS average of 54 and 1% lows of 40 for the Ryzen 5 5560U, and then the 5500U gives us an average of 63 with 1% lows of 44. So we're now able to get an above 60 FPS average out of the 5500U, while the 5560U just was never able to give us that. So there is a noticeable difference here. And of course, we are talking about one less GPU core and 200 megahertz lower clock speed in general. While there is an improvement in the CPU in the 5560U, it's just not necessarily enough to salvage the gaming experience here. For games where they're very GPU bound, like something like this, that extra CPU performance does absolutely nothing for us. And you'll see that even though it's set to a TDP of 25 watts, it pretty much never goes all the way up there because it doesn't need as much power to power the fewer GPU cores and the lower clock speed. And the CPU really isn't being loaded up by that much. So this is something to keep in mind if you do plan on picking up a system that has the 5560U. Just know that the lower GPU core count and clock speed is going to drag down the overall experience in a lot of these games. Now, of course, this is a GPU heavy game, and I'm very curious now to try out a wide variety of titles and see if that extra IPC at any point becomes useful for the 5560U, or if in general the lower clock speed and fewer cores of the GPU are going to be a detriment to the vast majority of the games. Now, because of the fact that almost every game is going to be GPU limited on these iGPUs, I get the feeling that it is going to be a problem in the vast majority of the games. But we'll just have to test and see. So if you're interested in seeing that, be sure to subscribe, and I will see you guys next time.